Hi, everybody, and away we go with another edition of the Stampede Wrestling Show.
Welcome, everybody, to Heartbeat Radio. I'm your guest host, Johnny Mantell, and I got Bruce Hart on the other line with me. How are you, Bruce, tonight?
I'm doing great, Johnny. It's nice to be back, and thanks for coming on and being our guest host tonight.
I'm going to ask you about a good Bruiser Brody story that you might have.
I unfortunately never met Frank personally. I was down in Amarillo just before he got started, I guess, but I knew I knew all these cronies of his, like Terry Funk and what's his face, Stan Hansen, Bobby Duncombe, and a bunch of those guys, and a lot of the guys I knew that worked with him in Japan, he was sort of an icon, or they had him on a sort of up on a pedestal, as one of those one-of-a-kind, trend-setting guys, and I never heard a bad word said about him as far as his work. He was one of those guys who sort of, sometimes it didn't please some of the promoters and stuff, but he sort of was pretty, did things his way. But most of the boys, I've always, I knew a lot of the guys who worked with him in different territories, and they all seemed to have a great deal of admiration for, his work in the ring, and he was kind of, one of a kind trendsetter type, he's almost like one of the guys who, pioneered that, I don't know what you call it, hardcore, or that kind of, ass-kicking style.
Yeah, the fight that he brought to the ring each and every night was always just that, and the fans knew that, he was coming to fight. He wasn't coming to laugh or, hang out and sit on the top rope. He was coming to fight. And as far as the boys, I imagine any of the guys, especially of our era, that were bookers or ended up being promoters, they might have been roughed a little bit by Frank, but all the boys in the dressing room, he was one of us, and liked everybody in the dressing room, and he was just one of us, man. If he was sitting here with us today, you and I in a room, we'd laugh and tell the same stories and have a great time.
Who are some of the guys that you'd compare him to, Johnny? Just as far as his personality, I've always been kind of intrigued, whether he was sort of a bit like Hanson or Murdoch or Terry or Abbey or
well,
who,
I think he was some of all of those, but maybe a little more quiet, which is sort of a funny thing to say. But lots of times when we rode together, it was just him and I. It was just a two-person trip, and he always stayed. His room was sort of secluded. He didn't, he got along and did everything with everybody, but he also sort of had that quiet side too, and very, very business savvy. Again, you're talking to somebody that I had the privilege of meeting him at 18, and he sort of shaped the rest of my career by what he told me, and I think that's how he worked. He loved this business, and he really wanted to protect it and make it that fight in the ring, and he did that his entire life.
It seemed to be, there was a really fertile breeding grounds back in the 70s, I guess, out of Texas. I remember so many great workers. I don't know, they'd come out of Amarillo or Fritz's territory or both, but it seemed to be just sort of a one after another of all these really exceptional, legendary workers that were coming up, like Murdoch and Duncombe and Dusty and yourself and Ken and Tito and DiBiase and Tully and Young Blood and all those guys, Gino Hernandez, and I had the pleasure of meeting them, but they all had that certain sort of style, and they also had a lot of pride, and they respected and protected the business. But it was a really golden age of wrestlers from Texas. I remember in the 70s, they all seemed to, still are spoken of in very respectful terms today, and they sort of were the cutting edge of workers back in those days, seemed to be like one after another, maybe starting with Dory and Terry. They were sort of two of the the guys who seemed to inspire a lot of it, but yeah, there was like a who's who list of really great workers coming out of Texas back then, and Brody was certainly one of them, but I'll have to, I'm during the course of this program, I hoping to maybe learn a few things from either yourself or Larry Matysik, who's coming on, and Barbara and Stan or whoever, because a lot of things I'm looking forward to just learning about Brody, and kind of what kind of inspired him and what was his how he launched his career and all those kinds of things, because he was one of those really kind of iconic characters who a lot of people still worship today, and I'm looking forward to learning a few things about his career and all that other,
I think that I saw Stan say, and he said to the public that night, he said, Frank was the brains of our operation, and to me, the two of them were the very first two real independent guys out there that worked in the business, because they were sort of independent guys. They didn't, they flew a little differently than everybody else in that time, and
yeah, I've often wondered, Ebby seemed to be, he seemed to be intertwined with them a bit, and Ebby was a character too, one of a kind as well. He danced to his own tune, and he's one of those types that you either seemed to was either loved or hated, type thing, But yeah, I've often wondered. I haven't spoke to Abby for a long time, so I never. I'd like to have gotten his perspectives on Brody and some of those guys, because he's often kind of synonymous with Brody, if only because of his wild, crazy bloodbaths and all the other kind of extreme type stuff, But yeah, they were like an art form in themselves, those guys. They and often imitated but never really duplicated. I've seen a lot of other guys trying to copy Abby or Brody, and never quite, really did justice to it, in my estimation.
Well, just the intensity like that, so hard to it's that intensity is sort of one of a kind. It's sort of like a hurricane. They're all labeled with a different number, and those kind of guys like that worked in the ring and worked so hard and again brought the fight every night to the ring like that were special guys. Hey, Bruce, we got on the line now with us Barbara Goodish, a woman I've gotten to know a little bit over the last few years, and I'm going to tell you she's as special as Frank was. Barbara, so nice to have you on tonight with Bruce Hart, and here's Johnny for you.
Well, thank you. It's a real privilege to be on.
Yeah, I'm honored that you graced our program tonight, Barbara. I'm a huge fan, and I just like to welcome you aboard, and thank you for coming on. I'm just looking forward to hearing some of the perspectives and all, and I'm delighted that Johnny, has seen fit to host this tonight, and that he knows you a bit. So, that'll make it that much more interesting for me. But thank you very much for coming on. It's an honor.
Well, I did get to meet your two brothers, Stu and Ross, but I didn't get to meet you at the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame, and that was such an honor to meet so many people up there too, and to reconnect with Johnny and his lovely wife, and Stan, and a host of other people. That was such an honor too, just to for him to get that honor for the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame this past May.
Yeah, I heard that was very well done. My brothers told me they were delighted to have met you, and I might add I had a chance to wrestle in New Zealand back in the '80s, so I got a familiar accent.
Okay.
I was down there for that old. I'm not sure if you knew him or not. That old Steve Rickard, and. But yeah, I was down there with Harley Race and Ric Flair and a bunch of them in '84. So, but yeah, nice to hear a Kiwi voice. I had great memories. So.
And Barbara,
Steve Rickard. Steve Rickard. That is a name, from the past.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Steve's. Hopefully, he's still alive. I don't even know. But he's a pretty decent old guy. I think we did all these like Christchurch and Auckland and Wellington and most of those main cities, but we were driving from one place to another, and it seemed like a lot of winding mountain roads and stuff like that. But
and only two ways, one way there and one way back. And
yeah,
you
I
got
remember
behind
that.
Cars. Yeah, you got behind cars on those twirly roads, and you could not pass.
Oh, I remember Harley Race was he doesn't like to, he's usually going pedal to the metal, and he was swearing and getting upset with the sheep herders or whatever that he was calling them that were, driving 20 miles an hour, and Harley was getting frustrated. But yeah, I remember had a good time over there. It was a very interesting place. So, but anyway, I'll let Johnny kind of direct traffic here.
Well,
okay.
First off, I got to say, Barbara, how are you feeling? I know you made a trip to Texas and had a little spill. Are you feeling okay?
Yeah, I just say I took a bump for the team.
Well, from Kay and I, it happened so close. We wish we would have known. We'd come got you, and you could have rehabbed up here at the farm with us.
I know. I was just so grateful that Stan just happened to be with me, and Karen Merritt, who used to help Frank out a lot in Dallas. She was also up there. I think she gave an award to the Queen of the Ring or something at the show that night, and they came to the emergency room with me and looked after me and took me back to the hotel. And like I said, I had a dislocated shoulder and contusions all over my leg, and I thought to myself, okay, now what would Frank do? He would get on that plane the next day and get home. And I did. I don't know how I did it, but I made it home.
Well, we're happy you did. I'm glad you're okay, and just heal up, and so we can see you again soon.
Right, yeah, I'm looking forward to the 2015 shootout.
Absolutely in February. We all look forward to it down here, and I'm trying to talk Bruce into coming down for one. He'd have a great time seeing a lot of the people that make the shootout. But I got to Bruce was asking me. He never had the privilege of meeting Frank, and he was asking me, a perspective of him, and I told him, I said, well, I sort of got to know him in a different way, because a lot of our interaction was just Frank and I in a car making a road trip here to there, or from this place to that place, and those were our interactions, unless we met at the airport or something. And to me, around me, he was quiet and reserved. I mean, he was a big stature of a man, and everybody knew it that was in the room, but he was quiet and very well spoken and very business savvy, and for me anyway, just sort of told me the truth the way it was, and I always appreciated that.
You see, the people he let into the inner sanctum, that was him. That was the real person. And as I've said before, that he created the wrestling persona, and then he had his home, and he never mixed the both up. So when you got him in a car away from everybody, you saw the real person, and then his fans and everybody else. He was a real person, too, as Bruiser Brody, King Kong. That was also, but that was like just playing a wonderful role, but not forgetting who he was and not losing himself in the character, which a lot of people do, regardless of what they do when they become in the public eye. So he kept himself as centered, got a place out in the country, 5 acres, so he could just come home and be, father, husband, be himself, like when he was writing, like with you, he would be himself and have just the regular. And I noticed by talking to a lot of people, he gave a lot of good advice to a lot of people. And, some of the stories I've heard are quite remarkable stories where he has helped people make life decisions that have really helped them in life.
Yeah, earlier Bruce and I were talking before you came on that there was sort of a band there from, I don't know, the early 70s, maybe through the late 70s, where a lot of guys got started in this business, and I think much like Frank giving that great advice, he was given that great advice from the from the Funks and from everybody in Amarillo that helped him guide and get him started, and I think that was something that just was actually part of this business. It was sort of the passing of the right of passing this knowledge from this generation on to the next, and I think Frank was a classic example of that, of a guy that passed that knowledge on like it was passed on to him when he started, and I know Bruce with the family, his family and the size of it, and all the guys, all the brothers in the business, he knows that as well, coming from his dad, right? I mean, that's a rite of passage. That's just part of how it's done, the right way, I should say, or the old-fashioned way.
Yeah, that was an incredible group of wrestlers that came out of Texas in the 70s. You talk about all these guys that legends or household names, guys like the Funks and Murdoch and Rhodes and Brody and Hanson and
they all came out of that same. And again, I think it was because of the passing on. And I don't know, Barbara, how much Frank talked about that or how that he got started or how that guidance was done. But I would guarantee it was classic old guidance that started and pushed him along the way. I would imagine.
I do believe that what you're saying is correct, and I know he also, as time came by, he mentored a lot of the younger wrestlers too that have come on to be quite good. I mean, I remember him talking about Terry Gordy and Hacksaw Higgins and several of these guys around about that same time.
Terry Gordy was another one, and I don't know whether Jay Youngblood, some of those guys, the Von Erichs too, I think were very well influenced by probably Frank, guys like Kerry Von Erich and Kevin and David, they all, unfortunately had short careers, some of them, unfortunately, but I think they all seem to come out in that era. I would have to think that those guys are very well-respected workers within the business, guys like Terry Gordy and them, so I'm sure, those are probably credit to Frank, if they were around him, and yeah, I was always fascinated by those guys. Just, I never got a chance to hook up with some of them, but, even today you always hear guys talking very reverentially about those guys, including Frank and Terry Gordy and the Gino Hernandezes and the Kerry Von Erichs and all like that.
Right.
Yeah, I think, again, it started, and Barbara's heard this story, so it's not that funny to her anymore. But when I was just 18 years old, I had the privilege of meeting. They told me to wait at the TV station. This guy by the name of Frank Goodish was going to come pick me up in a little white 240 or 260Z, and I said, well, how will I know it's him? And they said, well, you'll know when he gets out of the car. And this big old mountain of a man gets out of the car, and I come jumping out of the TV station to get in his car to ride with him that night, and that was our introduction. And I honestly believe that it was the fact that Frank every night brought 100%. He brought a fight to the ring. The people in the crowd knew that was going to happen. Didn't matter if he was fighting 10 men, 100 men, one guy in a tag team, if he was in a K, it didn't matter. They knew he was coming to fight. And here in Texas, with the Funks and everybody else here, you had to come fight every night, or you'd get lost in the mix.
Oh, they had a incredibly kind of wild, unique style down in Texas. I remember the first time I was down there in like '72, and it was really mayhem, but very entertaining. They had Terry and Dory Sr. was still alive then, and Murdoch, and I'm not sure. I think Stan was just breaking in then, but they had a real balls to the wall style, and I wasn't sure if that was who started that style, but it was really it's about 20 years ahead of its time, and I later on saw ECW to a degree copying it, but didn't really duplicate it either, but it was some really unique characters. I was going to ask you, Johnny and Barbara, who started Frank in the business? How did he get, who was his mentors, or who were the people that kind of launched him down there? Did he start in Dallas, or was it Amarillo, or where did he kind of get his feet wet?
I think it was Fritz, wasn't it, Johnny?
Well, I think the introductions may have started in Dallas, but it wasn't him and Stan roomed at the school in Canyon.
West Texas State.
At West Texas State, and I think that's really where a lot of the first introductions got made, and he probably started in Amarillo just because that's where he was going to school, was up in that part of the state.
Yeah, I remember being in Canyon, just outside of Amarillo there. West
between
Texas
Amarillo
State.
and Lubbock. It's on the highway between Amarillo and Lubbock, and I imagine he started, but a lot of those guys during that time would go back and forth for Fritz and the Funks, and so I'm sure that, and even the Blanchards, and for Paul Bosch in Houston, I'm sure the entire state got to see him when he started. I met him in '77, and he was full of life, and again at that time he brought the fight to the ring, and those people knew it, and everybody in the back sort of kept an eye on it because they wanted to see what he was going to do, and that was Bruce, that when somebody comes like that to an arena, when everybody goes out and watches, that's you need to sort of figure out what he's doing, and he was the guy every night that people went and watched.
Yeah, there wasn't enough of those guys. I remember a few of them, like another guy, and I heard he had some influence on Frank, was old King Curtis. I don't know whether he met him. He was up here in the 70s too, old Curtis, but he was one of those kind of, larger than life kind of unique type personalities in and out of the ring, but yeah, it's funny you mentioned some of those names, because quite a few of them started up here way back in the 50s for my dad, like Blanchard and Fritz, and a few of those other old Texas guys. My dad seemed to, Frankie Murdoch, who was I think Dick's father, and a bunch of those old, and they're all pretty colorful characters in and out of the ring too. But I remember when I was a real little kid meeting a lot of those people. And they had very kind of magnetic personalities or kind of rich characters. So I can only imagine Frank was probably along those lines, because all those people are sort of iconic. Some of the names you've been mentioning, everyone seems to remember them. They had really kind of, vibrant personalities and a lot of character and a lot of passion and all that type of thing,
And then you have to remember, he didn't get into wrestling straight out of college, because he got picked up by the Washington Redskins and got cut, and then he went to several semi-pro teams, which ended up, I think he was in Canada at some point. He was in Mexico.
Oh, yeah, I was told later on that he played up in Edmonton for the Eskimos.
That's right.
My dad was actually... my dad played for the Eskimos, too. He sort of...
Okay.
He was big on all these football players. He had a whole bunch of them, including guys like Kiniski and Joe Blanchard and Wilbur Snyder, and all these guys were all sort of football player types that my dad started. But I remember for the longest time, my dad was he was always trying to get Frank up here, usually through Dory or Terry or whatever, and he had a whole bunch of these Amarillo types up here, like Cyclone Negro and Larry Lane and all that, but never quite came off. I think Frank's career took off somewhere around that time, and he, I think, was making more money elsewhere than he could make up here. So, but I remember my dad was, and because my dad had a big thing, he was really sort of big on big wrestlers. He always wanted, the big guys like the Abdullahs and the King Curtises and that type of thing. So, but I remember for the longest time, my dad was always seeking to get Bruiser Brody to impersonate. But yeah, I remember my dad was a big fan. He always and it meant a lot to him that Frank, I guess, had played for the Eskimos, because my dad was passionate. I think he played for the Eskimos himself in 38, 39, way back when, So it was kind of a big one more thing. He loved the football players. He always had a sort of a passion for them. That was one more thing. If a guy was a football player, then my dad was, that much more inspired to have them up here or whatever.
Right. And then I think he ended up playing for the San Antonio Toro, and I think Ivan Putski was also playing for that team. And I think that's how it all came into the wrestling. Then he went into journalism. He was a sports writer at the San Antonio Express News in those days, and he did it in Dallas too. So in between all that, somehow the wrestling business, with all the connections he knew, like you said, through football and that, and I think he was wondering what he was going to do, because trying to be a sports writer, they would always make jokes as his fingers were too big for the keys to type in those days. So he was,
Yeah, I'm intrigued just as you're talking about him sitting over a typewriter, and back then they didn't have the automatic keyboards or anything.
Right. It was just boom, boom. And he couldn't get the copyright out because his fingers were too big, so
he would have, I would imagine him would have been intimidating to get some of these, football players or whatever that are about half his size. And, most sports writers are like little skinny, paunchy guys with cigarette in one hand and a microphone in the other, and maybe 5'5" and 130 pounds.
Yeah, because I remember him. I remember him telling me once that it got to the point where he was getting to that age. He said, "Well, what career can I go in?" The sports writing wasn't panning out. The football was finished. He was already finished with the football, and it came down to two. He said, a policeman or a wrestler. And he figured out wrestler was the best bet to make a little bit more money than a policeman.
Well, he would have been intimidating at either spot, I guarantee. He would have got the job done. Hey, while we're taking just a pause right here, and I got to tell everybody you're listening to Heartbeat Radio with Bruce Hart on Powerhouse Radio. And tonight, our special guest, Barbara Goodish, Mrs. Bruiser Brody, and I'm your guest host, Johnny Mantell. And I got Larry Matysik on the phone with us. We're going to bring on at this time to join the fray. Larry, how are you tonight?
Hey, I'm doing great, and good to talk to you, Johnny. And Barbara, of course, we just talked a couple of days ago. I hope you're feeling well. Everything okay, Barbara?
Yep, hanging in there, my boy.
Okay, glad to see that, and good talking to everybody, and Bruce. And, geez, you were talking about the Frank Goodish stories. Of course, I knew him a lot from St. Louis, obviously, when he came here and was a major town for him when he hit here in 1978. But really the big thing, and I guess I'll brag about Barbara right now, is when we did the book Brody for ECW Press out of Toronto, which has been really one of the best-selling books they've ever published at this point. Barbara and I were co-writers on it, and Barbara turned out to be what a tale-teller she is. I mean, she was terrific. And what we did basically was I'd do a chapter about the wrestling, and then Barbara do a chapter about how she met Frank, and just fascinating stuff about what happened in Australia and her getting up here and coming to the States, and she comes to the States. Well, I'll let her tell the story, but they're just fascinating things, how she got to meet Frank Goodish, how she got to know Frank Goodish, and showing people that there's a lot more to professional wrestlers than any of them ever realized, and just what great stuff. And when you talked about the journalism, by the way, in the book, one of the pictures we have in the book, and I think, Barbara, you found it in your files at home,
right,
is a picture of Frank Goodish at a typewriter typing for the San Antonio newspaper. And it's fascinating because he's got his hair cut short, and he's got a coat and got a shirt and tie on. I don't think he had the coat on. I think he had the sport coat off, but he had the shirt and tie, and there he is typing. He doesn't look like your stereotypical sports writer, I can assure you that. Even then, he was a little bit of Bruiser Brody, I think.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen a picture of Frank without the beard and the long hair. So
well, you gotta get you a copy of the book. But Barbara did a great job, and I praise her here. And I think at first, and jump on me if I'm wrong here, Barbara, you were a little hesitant to do it. And
yes,
when we talked about doing the book, and what I kind of threw out was there are so many stories about this man, and a lot of them are baloney. A lot of them have been twisted far beyond the recognition of the truth. A lot of them don't give him credit that he deserves. The only way people will find out the truth, the only way that people will see what Frank Goodish was as Bruiser Brody and as a father, as a husband, is if you help write it. And Barbara just opened up and relaxed, and you did a great job, kiddo. I was proud of you.
Well, thank you, because my son had gone to visit my son, Jeff, or his son, in Austin. It was just when the Internet was just getting on, and I didn't have a computer or anything back then. I had to get a computer to write the book. And he said, type in Bruiser Brody. And I said, why? He said, just type it in, the search. Well, I typed it in, and I guess you'd say I was naive, and I was shocked when I started reading some of the things that were on the Internet about him. And, I mean, so much of it was so far from the truth, and that's at the same time that Larry was asking me about the book. And that was what really made it, with Larry, who Frank trusted, with me, who knew the story beyond the man, and it was the truth. And then there's other books out there, and there's, like you said, Larry, I like that word, baloney. And I figured, like you said, Larry, that the two people that knew the ultimate truth was myself and was Larry. There was three of the people that Frank trusted are on the show tonight. There was a few more, the Funks, and there's a few more too, but Larry, yourself, Stan, and Johnny. And as you said, you got into his inner circle, and you were there because he trusted you, and he knew that you trusted him. So thanks, Larry. I'm so good. And it was very good for me to write a lot of this stuff, because this is a lot of stuff that what happened after Frank left us was all of a sudden the life that I knew it was just gone. And one day it was gone. And I had lived so much off the wrestling business for so many years, and it was gone, except for the few people that kept in touch with me. There was nobody, because in an ordinary life, you can't. It's like I feel like wrestling is like a family because you can open up, you can talk honestly, and a lot of the people out there don't really understand what a family it is.
It is, and again, through Frank, and it's funny. I feel sad that I didn't get to see Johnny Mantell more, and Stan Hansen. God, what the things I've learned about Stan, and the fine man that he has been since Frank's passing, for Jeffrey, for Barbara. People don't appreciate that. I mean, a tremendous wrestler. Yeah, I put him in. You're in the top 50 of my 50 all-time greatest wrestlers, Stan, in my book. So that was good. But they don't realize the things that Stan Hansen did that were so human, and that people don't give wrestlers and people in this business credit for. And you hang together, you do what you can to help as much as you can. But that was a terrible time for Barbara, and she got through it, and I know it was hard for her to write parts of the book. And when she opened up her files to us and dug into her files, probably things that you didn't even know you had. What a great bunch of pictures. Some of the pictures she gave us in the Brody book, where here's Frank rolling around on the floor with Jeffrey, pulling his hair, and they're having a wrestling match. And there's one Christmas picture where he'd just come, I think, from Dallas or somewhere, and he must have worked with Kamala or somebody, because the scars are all fresh. And there he is in front of a Christmas tree, Christmas tree with Jeffrey and Barbara, and his head's just ready to go. And just fascinating stuff when you see it. But at least this way, people got a chance to hear the truth of what happened, and we tried not to hide anything. I mean, there were some things that were controversial. We talked about him. But I was lucky here in St. Louis because another guy that he did trust was my old boss, the legendary promoter Sam Muchnick. And, of course, part of that was he came in, he shook Sam's hand, and Sam paid him every dime he said he'd ever pay him. And I can remember when Barbara was pregnant, and that night we had a wrestling card in St. Louis. I came to the office, and our office was, of course, in typical wrestling fashion, in a hotel. I came in, and the gal on the desk said, "You got to get a hold of Frank when he gets here. His wife's having the baby now." Oh, my God. So because he was on his way driving in from Kansas City at the time. I get upstairs, I tell Sam. Just about that time, I guess Frank got in there. He stopped at the front desk. The gal told him, your wife's having the baby. You should get back. He's coming upstairs to tell Sam, hey, I can't wrestle tonight. Barbara's having the baby. When he came into the door, when he came into the office, the first thing Sam Muchnick said to him was, "What are you doing here? Why aren't you at the airport? Your wife's having a baby. Would you go?" As opposed to some promoters who had said, "Hey, can't you work the spot? After all, you're in the fourth match. You can get up there after. You can get home after the show, can't you?" Sam said, "What are you doing here?" And I think that cemented their relationship too, and just his whole relationship with St. Louis. He did commercials here. We did some TV spots for this crazy TV guy, Steve Miserani, where Steve Miserani's riding around on roller skates and Frank Brody's picking him up over his head, and just all these silly spots. We did things at the racetrack, the horse race track, where Frank put on the gear and he's pulling the little carts that the horse racers use just to get in shape for a match. We had a match at the racetrack once with him and I think it was Ox Baker, and he was getting in shape for that. But all these little things we did, and we throw out these ideas. We could just sit there and bounce ideas. Hey, well, let's try it. I'll talk to somebody, and it all fell together. So for me, for us, for St. Louis, and then eventually we started working some independent shows around here when I was with Vince McMahon in the 80s, and Frank was the ultimate outlaw, along with certain people like Mr. Hansen. It really cemented a very special relationship. I miss him terribly, as I know Barbara does, and I can't say enough about what she did in helping write that book and being part of writing that book. Without her, it's not a book.
I was going to ask you guys, do you think Frank would have ever evolved into working for WWF? Or I've often been asked that question,
That was worth writing a chapter in the book trying to do that one. Stan some people could all chime in on this. I heard various stories. I think in my gut, if the money were right and the deal was right, he could have gone for a shot with Hogan.
Yeah.
I often wondered, because just from an outsider perspective, it seemed like it would have been a match made in heaven or hell. One or the other,
maybe both. But you got to remember, he had his deal with Baba and with Japan back then. So he wasn't going to jeopardize that unless he had a really definite shot, a really definite agreement with Vince McMahon. But correct me again if I'm wrong, Barbara, when he first got his real big-time jump after Dallas with Fritz and the people down there and then a little bit in Mid-South, he went to New York, and he went as Frank Goodish, and the name Bruiser Brody was given to him by none other than Vince McMahon Sr.
Oh, is that right?
And the matches that he worked, the first tapes I saw of Bruiser Brody were matches between Bruiser Brody and Bruno Sammartino. And correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Vince Sr. call pretty often and have a relationship with Frank?
Oh yes, I mean he was one of the few people that called. The senior called a lot of times at the house. They, whatever it was, they did have some relationship, but of course when the senior passed on, that kind of all faded because no, they were working something out. There was going to be some business deal between the two just before because there was just too much, as I said, because I would take all the messages, and of course this was before answering machines and cell phones and all this modern technology we have today. I was the booker and the traveler and the receptionist and you name it, and so I would take all the telephone calls, and Senior was one person that did call a lot to the house.
I'm fascinated. I never even knew that was the evolution of the name Bruiser Brody.
Well, we booked him here as King Kong, and the reason we did that here, of course, we had Dick the Bruiser in St. Louis, so
yeah,
well, that'd be two Bruisers. So when we knew we were bringing Brody in, I had a picture that Vince McMahon Sr. had done when Frank was up in New York, where he was next to the picture of the statue, the Empire State Building. Was it Fay Ray climbing the building with the gorilla?
Oh, yeah.
The movie. And I thought, man, that looks pretty good. What if we could call him King Kong Brody? So typical, I went to sat down with Sam. I said, what do you think of this idea? And he started chuckling. He said, that's a pretty good idea. See what he thinks. And so when he got in town to work his first house show for us, I asked him, and he just kind of laughed. He said, call me anything you want, as long as they pay me. That sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So we booked him as King Kong Brody at that point. So confusing everybody, of course, in the entire wrestling business. Well, who's King Kong Brody? Is he any relation to Bruiser Brody? Yeah, okay. That first drop kick he hit, boy, that made everybody stand up. When he worked TV and a 300-pound man threw that first drop kick in there, and of course I was doing the commentary on Wrestling at the Chase, and I went crazy. Oh my God, look at that drop kick! And the people saw that. He was over like $1 million. Anything from there, yeah.
And he'd drop it right on your chin. And I got to chime in, talking about would he have gone to work and worked for Vince, and I think my personal self, I think like you said, if the money was right, for sure he was going to. I see it as a relationship that probably would have ran for a little while, and then they had a little bit of an argument, and they'd run for a little while just because Frank was going to do it his way. I know with me during the early Dallas years, 82 to 86, when we were here in Dallas, and my brother was a booker during about a 4-year span there. Anytime Frank saw me at an airport or we met someplace to ride to a town, he would first give me sort of the Catholic cross and sort of devil me. Of course, my brother Kenny was a booker, so he wanted to make sure that none of the booker side was with him that day when I was with him for our trip, and it was always sort of a joke because him and my brother didn't get along very well because, of course, Kenny would have to bring bad news, and then Frank would have to give other bad news, and then there'd be some kind of argument. But that was part of that business. I mean, Frank, you know that. Bruce, you know that. That was part of the business at that time. And Frank was strong-willed. He did what he thought was best for business and for Frank, and that's what he did night in and night out. And so he may have roughed some guys wrong, and with Vince, I'm sure with Vince it would probably have been on and off, but there was no way there's no way they couldn't have used him because of his talent.
I know I booked up here, and over the years you'd have a few guys that kind of they were pretty hard set in their ways, like David Schultz and Bad News Allen and some of them. And but yeah, you could never let it get too personal. You sort of about diplomacy. Somehow you'd try to arrive at some happy medium, But yeah, I always heard Frank was a businessman, though. He wasn't sort of like some guys were just sort of was about ego and kind of one-upmanship and all. But I always heard that Frank was essentially a businessman, and if you appreciated that, then you could do business with him. So I'm sure that was probably the case.
Yeah, it happens certainly here in St. Louis too. We didn't ask him to do many jobs because our main event guys didn't get asked to do many. I mean, unless they were against somebody else or against the world champion. But he did it twice for Harley Race when Harley had the belt, no problem at all. And he did one for Ted DiBiase, which DiBiase had already done for him. And I can still remember that night. I guess I was in the room with DiBiase, and Frank came in and he says, "I just want you to know, kid, I'd only do this for you." And DiBiase his eyes got kind of big. Oh, okay, yeah, I understand, Frank, I understand. But there was never a problem like that. And as far as him working with Hogan eventually, they'd eaten everybody up. And you guys remember this, but you're talking 85, 86, 87. They'd eaten up all the heels for Hogan. They'd stolen all of them. There was nobody left that he hadn't touched. Who was left out there except for...
Not many, yeah. He had beat everyone from Andre to, John Studd to...
So who was left?
Yeah.
Brody, yeah.
Yeah, there wasn't... I can't think of any off the top of my head, There was very few that they hadn't chewed up and spit out, so...
Exactly. So that's why eventually... I think it had to come to pass, but also, as Johnny just said, eventually that marriage was not made in heaven, and that marriage probably had a divorce in it down the road. But I think they both would have known that going in. They said, "Hey, we each get a year or two out of it. We each make money out of it. Well, what the heck? That's not a bad deal. I can live with that." And it would have been business, and that would have been it, and that would have been fine.
Yeah, I'm sure that. They could have. I honestly think they could have got several years out of it, and if Vince was letting Frank go to Japan or have some outlets, then it would have probably been good,
Well, I don't think, and Barbara, you might correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think Frank would ever agree to anything if it would have interrupted his Japan thing and what he was doing there. He wouldn't have let anything interrupt that.
No, because that was his number one. Yeah. That was his number one show, and that treated him good and paid him right. And after the few little hiccups he had over there, it was getting to be a pretty smooth path over there. And that's what he protected all times, was the Japan, because he knew whatever happened in the States was news in Japan the very next day.
Yes.
It was funny when he was here going in and out of St. Louis. There's a movie called Escape from New York. I don't know if many people remember it. I
remember hearing of that.
Yeah, Kurt Russell. Well, and Ox Baker was in that movie. Well, that original spot was supposed to be Brody's, and of course they filmed in St. Louis. A lot of the stuff was filmed like 3 blocks from where our wrestling office was on Locust Street in downtown St. Louis. And when they were looking for somebody to be this monster bad guy, they came to us, and the first one Sam thought of was, oh, let's call Brody. And I think if I remember all this right, now we're looking back, wow, do I want to really think about this, 35 years? Ooh, gosh. But they had the dates set, and that was right about the time, either the first or, I guess it was like the second or third trip he'd made to Japan. He'd gotten over like $1 million the first time. And he called Sam, and they had, I heard parts of it, I heard one side of it. And, Sam understood, and he said, that's fine, we'll find somebody, that's okay, yeah, I understand. Which, again, was one of the reasons probably why we got along so well in St. Louis. He understood what was happening in Japan, and that was important. And, of course, Muchnick and Baba had a great relationship, too. So Brody then went to Japan, and this the next person we happened to come across name-wise, face-wise, they wanted somebody, a visual character. Well, it was Ox Baker. So Ox Baker ended up in Escape from New York, but had the booking dates. The dates been different in Japan back in that time. That could have very easily have been co-starring Frank Goodish, Bruiser Brody.
Wow.
But also, Stallone, for one of his movies, was after Frank, too. I think it was Over the Top. It was one of these movies that he was doing. You know how he liked to have big guys in his movies? And I remember taking phone calls from his Stallone's management company several times, but it was the same thing. It interfered with Japan. So Frank said no to that too, because he said he didn't want anything to interfere with Japan, because he knew that sometimes to do something, you lose out on something that is guaranteed. So he'd had several offers to do something, but every one of them kind of just, was the Japan trip. So, no, he would not do anything to jeopardize Japan.
And, we go back to old legends and old, how people started in the business and how they were treated and how they were brought in. And, of course, the dungeon in Calgary is famous, and, the different places around the country where guys broke into this business. But, here again, we're hearing that about Frank. And the bottom line was, and when Stan comes on, he'll agree with us on this, that Stan and Frank were so loyal to Japan because they knew that was home to them as far as what they were doing in this business at that time. Again, you got to remember, this is during a time and change in the business. The business is changing some, however you want to say it was going left or right, whatever, it was changing some. And Japan was still the same market for that gimmick and for that, taking that fight to the ring night in and night out. And they knew that. And that's how loyal they were. And I think that goes back to saying, the guys that taught them and started them. And then, Barbara, you saying that now you're hearing so many guys like myself that took Frank's advice to the hilt and used it their entire career and a lot of their life. And that's because he was passing that thing on that was passed on to him. And it's just like, writing this book and Mr. Matysik writing his book and telling his side from the office there in St. Louis is telling that side of him too, that you don't hear, because you do hear the bad stories about Frank and Stan and a lot of the independent guys out there that would say no to people. Oh my gosh, they said no to somebody. They were taking care of business, and I think that's an admirable place to be in life and to be remembered for right there.
No, I was just going to say, he put his fans first, because he knew if they left and had a great time, they would be back. And that was who he thought, what would the fans like? How to get them back in the building, maybe get a few more back, get a bigger house. And I think that, and everything that he did, he had those fans. And now I can see that it must have worked, because all these fans, and some of them are just little kids, and he has not been around for 26 years, and all these people that come up and will tell me stories, and some of them are just getting into it, had never seen him wrestle or anything, but had been there as a kid or heard their parents, and it worked. Whatever he did, and the fans remember today.
And I think all you guys know this, all of us recognize this. You can teach a lot of things about wrestling. You can get them in a ring. You can find out how to do an arm drag. You can find out how to do a drop kick. But you can't teach charisma. You got it or you don't. And Frank Goodish had charisma.
Yeah, it's not enough guys do.
Well, I think too. Again, I think that cream rises to the top. All them old cliches and stuff. You just know it, and when he brought that fight to the ring every night, again, the people knew he was coming. It was no hesitation. There was no doubt. There was no. He wasn't gonna run a sweep around the right end. He was gonna run the ball straight up the middle.
Green Bay Packers, right up the middle.
Right up the middle. 3 yards in a cloud of dust, and he was going to make it. And that's what he brought night in and night out. And you can't you can't duplicate that. It was just part of, like you said, his charisma, his being, his persona. When, as Barbara said it, when he left and became Bruiser Brody, the big guy at the wrestling arena, when he was that persona, there was no doubt. And you never saw him drop to a knee and beg to somebody. You never saw him do any of those things that were cliche for that time when they did that. And I admired him for that, and he did it night in and night out. He might smell like a jar of Tiger Balm, rubbing himself down and feeling good when he went to the ring. Now he sure might have smelled like a bottle of Tiger Balm, but he got the job done, and that's what this business is about. And the other thing I got to add right there, when you're talking about he wanted to make the house better and get more people there and sell it out and do all that. He wasn't just doing that for him. He was doing that for everybody on the card. And the boys in the back knew it.
They don't understand that if the house is bigger, he gets more money, but everybody gets more money.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I wish there was more guys like that. Business would be a lot better today if there was, or doing it all for the business, not just for themselves or whatever,
And when we ran a lot of independent cards here around St. Louis, I was working for McMahon from 83 on, but we were also running independent cards, and Frank kind of got into it, and we found a good friend here locally, Herb Simmons, and used his license, and about once a month we'd come up here, and we'd get cash up front and everything, and we'd have a little deal with 2 or 3 promoters, and we'd have a weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, something like that, as Barbara would remember. And like Johnny, probably especially, you made a lot of rides all over Illinois and Missouri with him, and you'd talk in that car, and it was amazing when you could settle down. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, just got a hamburger at a truck stop, and God, was that hamburger bad. Ugh. But, you'd be talking about the things, the knowledge of the business, and the knowledge that I learned. I learned talking to him and everything. And one of the things is just throwing it out there now and tying it into Vince McMahon and how wrestling has changed to become whatever it has become. I remember Frank saying back in that day, he says, whoever has control of television will make professional wrestling what professional wrestling is, because the kids that are growing up then, they're going to be getting gone, or they're going to be going away. The guy who has television will be educating the new people. And they'll think, well, that's what wrestling's always been. They'll never have heard Fritz von Erich. Who's that? They'll never have heard of Stu Hart. Who's that? They'll never have heard of Dick the Bruiser. All they know is John Cena. And people like that. And Frank picked up on that right away, that if Vince had control of the TV, which of course is what eventually did happen, that he would determine what professional wrestling is. And if Vince happens to feel it's a television production that just happens to have the wrestling name attached to it, well, that's the way it's going to be. So that's one of the many things. And I think all that, what they call him in Japan a lot of times, the intelligent monster. Sometimes I come out there. Yeah, when you do the interview with him, he was a great interview doing the interview with, because had to be paying attention to stay with him, because he's going to come up with some things. You better throw some good softballs and curveballs out there, because we're going to be working together on the interview as much as you guys are working in the ring. So smart, intelligent, charismatic, and let me throw one question out to Barbara, and then I'll get out of your guys' way. I don't want to. If we're still here, and this is something we've talked about, so I'm kind of cheating here. I'm throwing Barbara a softball, but it's okay. She deserves it. Where would he have been? Would he have been in wrestling? Would he have been in politics? Because one of the things he and I talked about even was starting a sports management company. And this was back 87, 80, early part of 88. Frank and I talked about starting a sports management company, working together, where he could work with the athletes, and I knew the office and the writing and how to do the writing type stuff, the marketing type stuff. We could do something like that. But there was politics. There were a lot of things. Jesse Ventura became the governor of Minnesota, so let's not snicker here anywhere. Well, to say that Frank Goodish couldn't have been a senator or a House of Representatives.
You have to remember he had already formed a corporation called, it was called Brody Athletic Management, done as BAM. BAM.
And I still have
Brody
the T-shirt.
Athletic Management. It had T-shirts, it had cards, it had everything. It was a fully functioning corporation. Just before that, he had bought a wrestling ring. He was working with a professor at the UT there in the University of Texas in San Antonio to write skits, and he was even thinking about maybe going around schools, putting up a wrestling ring and talking to the youth about the dangers of what they face in life, and thinking that for someone like him talking to these people, they would understand and maybe listen. and doing it in a way that they could identify with, and had also bought a piece of land, 45 acres, with a little river running through it, that he was going to build like a boys' town, like camping, had the river, fishing, everything, and, had the ring there that bring boys that maybe are at risk, and bring them out there and have a little camp, and, because sometimes it just takes someone to care to change a person's life. And this was already set up, so yes, he had great things that he had planned in his future before everything happened, and it was already just starting.
So, yeah, as far as being with Vince, I'm sure that possibility would have been there, but somewhere down deep, maybe I'm wrong, but somewhere down deep, I kind of think there might have been a little bit more in his future than just Vince McMahon. So
yes.
I just throw that out there.
He was looking at life after wrestling, because he knew, you're big, you take a lot of bumps, your body starts shutting down. You can't take bumps when you're 70 years old.
Now, don't tell Terry Funk that. Now, wait a minute.
I know. I know. I saw Terry and okay. But Larry, before you go, I want you to say, Larry and Herb Simmons runs a little show still, like old school wrestling, that have had a lot of write-ups done, and out there in the St. Louis area, runs at what? Once a month or something?
Once a month, unless we pick up a spot show here and there, but once a month, yeah.
They have a little TV show. Jim Cornette wrote a wonderful article. He had gone there. I think Ox Baker has been there. Paul Orndorff has been there, right?
Hacksaw Duggan.
Yep, and all these people. And this is like the old-fashioned, how it used to be in the old days. And they had invited me down. I think it was a couple of years I was down there. And it was so weird because they kind of put me to work. So they put me up.
Oh, Barbara tried to give a chair to a wrestler and tell him to hit somebody. Can you believe that?
Absolutely.
But the thing was, to make the story short, they still chant Brody. I mean,
yes.
The weirdest thing, they still chant Brody. And to fast forward, and they do that in St. Louis. At the show on Saturday night, when it was announced for the 50th anniversary of the award for the Cauliflower Alley Club, they started chanting Brody. This is Dallas, 26 years later, and the crowd was chanting Brody.
Yeah, you could plan that. You can't. You guys, you just can't plan things like that. If it happens, all you can do is just get on the horse and ride. And, we're so fortunate up here. I mean, we have a building seats about 300 people, and we put about 300 people in it every time. Try to concentrate on the wrestling as I grew up on it, booking it as I grew up booking it, which really isn't that much. It's not that much more complicated. I think it's simple, honestly. But nonetheless, there's so many people that remember Brody, and, of course, Herb Simmons was a huge fan of Frank's. And that name will always come up, or if there's ever any mention. Hacksaw Duggan was there. And Herb did a little interview with him in the ring. And he says, "How did you first start carrying the 2x4?" And he says, "Well, actually," he says, you may have heard of this guy. He says, "It was Bruiser Brody started me doing it. The next thing he knows, half the people there yelling, 'Brody, Brody.'" And he says, "Yeah, okay, you know him." He says, "Well," he says, "I was breaking into the business, and I didn't know how to get people's attention when I came out." And Brody says, "Just grab a 2x4 so you can clear people out when you go to the ring. Swing that 2x4 around. See if they remember you." He says, "I did that. I've been doing it ever since." He says, "That was Brody's gimmick." But as Barbara said, the people just started chanting, "Brody, Brody, Brody." And, it's a neat feeling. And when Barbara was there, they chanted it, too. That's why when she gave Ron Powers the chair, Ron, of course, was one of the young guys that got to know Brody a little bit up here and had tremendous help. And Johnny's going to laugh at this, is now wearing a mask and is calling himself Red River Jack. Keep that in mind. It's a little gimmick we're doing. But, it's truly fascinating. And I think the world of him, and I think the world of Brody. Hey, you guys have a tremendous talk about him all you want. When Stan's there, please give him my best, give him my love. I'm sorry he's a man that I didn't get to meet more than I did. And thank you so much for letting me on to be a part of this. You guys do great.
Yeah,
Barbara, get healthy.
I will, promise.
Sounds good. Thank you, folks. Take care.
Thanks,
You too.
Larry. All right, Larry Matysik, the co-writer of the book with Barbara, and again, great perspective of where he sat, in and out when Frank was going in and out of there. And Barbara, I know you told me about that trip. You told me about that trip up there with Larry and them in St. Louis, and what a great time you had. And just as we lost Larry, our next family member is called in, so I'm going to bring in the ever so friendly and my friend, and I know Barbara's friend, and Bruce, with the Lariat unattached tonight, Stan Hanson. Stan, how are you?
I'm doing okay. How are y'all? I'm more concerned and worried about Barbara from this last weekend. I'm sure
I know. Yeah, he was with me all times. No, it's going to be about the rest of the year rehabilitation. So it's going to take a little bit to recover because I can't drive for probably about 6 weeks until I can't use my shoulder. And then I know all of you know about dislocated shoulders, that you have to kind of keep them totally immobile because they can pop out at any time. So it's just going to be a long, slow recovery. But hey, what can you do? You just have to take the punches when they come. But I have something to look for. Yeah, grin and bear it. But as I said, I have 2 things to get healthy for: February for the shootout, and April for the 50th anniversary of the CAC.
Well, I might try to make both those.
You need to.
I must say, I mean, the whole time Barbara, when she first got hurt and everything, I was there, and I mean, there was actually a nurse was there, and she says, "Well, I think it's dislocated," and of course we had immobilized it at the time, and she wasn't, she wasn't just screaming in pain or anything, So all the way to the hospital, I said, it's not dislocated. It's just probably, it might have got separated, it popped back in and everything, because it's not you'd be just in so much pain, and she just wasn't acting like she was in that much pain when, she had her arm immobilized. But when the doctor came back and he says, "Oh yeah, it's dislocated," I just fell out. I felt so bad. I said, "Golly, man, I really had it wrong." But she's one tough lady. She's definitely Brody's wife for sure. I guess he taught her to be tough or something, man, because it was dislocated, and they had to put her under to put it back in, and wow, it was quite an experience. But I'm glad she's going to get some rest.
Stan, you told me that you were right behind her, and if she hadn't fallen and made a noise, that you might have just landed right on top of her.
Yeah, we were all looking at this huge, this whole wall was covered with a picture of Frank. And Barbara says, "Oh, I love this picture," and then she's looking, so I'm looking up, and, and we're just kind of walking towards the back of the stage, but we never even looked down that there was about like a 3-foot gap between the wall and the end of the stage. And she went off. Man, I was just right on the edge. I mean, I'd taken another step, I would have fell right on top of her, probably, But anyway, it was a scary moment for sure. And golly, anyway, we were both admiring Frank.
There you go. There you go. Hey, well, we've been talking about Frank, and Larry brought a little perspective and talked about the book and everything, and I know the comments you made about Frank up at the Hall of Fame last year, and so give us a perspective of Frank in this business and what he's meant to it.
Well, we both gravitated towards Japan, and he was with Baba's office, All Japan, in the beginning, and I kind of came up through Inoki's group, New Japan. But then, things happened, and they started, there was kind of a talent war kind of went on and everything. And anyway, eventually, I went back over to Baba's group, and Frank was there. And one of the reasons that I was excited about going there, and I actually came and visited with Frank in private and tell him that this was maybe thinking to go on and what he thought and, what the opportunities were for us. And he agreed. But anyway, so, we had great success there. And Frank was just, a great partner. He was for sure. But we were, without sounding too braggadocious, we were the dominant tag team probably in all wrestling there in the early 80s. And, we just outran everybody, and they could keep up. But anyway, Frank was so much. He was a lot different than me. He was a student of wrestling, and I think that because of his independent work and because of I usually, like I said, I basically stayed in Japan and worked for some different groups. The mainstream wrestling promotions, the Georgia or different places like that. But Frank, for quite a bit of the time, he was on the independent circuit, and I think in that sense, he became really in tune to wrestling, and he was a thinker, and he thought. I always felt like that he was one of the guys that probably had one of the better minds for wrestling and how to promote himself first and foremost, but also promote the wrestling business and draw, and make money for independent promoters and himself. So I always felt that Frank was really on the cutting edge of how to do the wrestling business.
Well, Mr. Matysik asked Barbara a question about what would Frank be doing today. So I'm going to ask you that. If Frank was still with us today, what would he be doing today? What would you see him really getting into? We know that he was starting a management company for athletes and different things. What would you see him doing today?
Well, I'm just going to tell you what he told me he'd be doing.
Okay.
This is way back. He says, you know what? I started in the opening match, and I'm going to end up in the opening match. In other words, he'd be another Terry or Dory Funk. He would. I don't think he would. He really loved to go out there and to be able to perform, and he loved wrestling. And I don't know if he was joking when he said that, but anyway. I think he did love the business, and he loved getting into the ring. Whether he'd be on the opening match, he'd probably be on the main event. But he was just saying that the whole circle, if you stay long enough, you can work your way back down too. But sadly to say, he didn't get that opportunity.
And I think too, the fact that he, like Barbara said, so many people have said that he said things to them that they've used the rest of their career, their life, and he's sort of been a mentor. I think he would have always found some way to give back. I really believe that because of the respect he had for it.
Yeah, I agree. I think he liked a lot of the young guys that come along. He was always there to help as we got help too along the way. And I think that he did give certain people some great advice, and obviously he was a student of the business, so I think a lot of people respected him in that way.
Yeah. So I don't want to throw you under the bus, but you and Stan or you and Frank were roommates. Can we just have a story or a lesson from that time or something?
Well, you know, we did. We down in Baton Rouge, we kind of shared an apartment with Luke Brown, Grizzly Smith's partner, and we all kind of healed into
at the 10 flag. At the 10
well,
flag?
It was right next door. It was actually right next door to the 10 flag. But yeah, that's right. It was right next door to the 10 flag. So you can imagine what it was. It was a step above at that time, probably the Alamo Plaza. But anyway, we were really tight. We weren't making any money to start with, so we really had to. And I think because of that tightness monetarily, we just we kind of gravitated together, and we were both looking to try to save money, even if we're only getting paid, $40. We'd try to, put 5 of it away, So anyway, I think that's what kind of got us together. But one time Frank was, he told me years later that he was over in Japan. I mean, it wasn't Japan. It was someplace else. It could have been Australia or something like that. And he ended up, he was in the dressing room, and he wore these kind of shorts. They weren't actually underwear shorts. They were just kind of gym shorts, the old short kind of old gym shorts that they had back there. And so
the Tokyo Capital ones.
It could be, but anyway, he was saying, he says, God, he looked over at a dressing room, in the dressing room, and there was somebody over there, and he says, hey, man, those are my shorts. And he goes, what? The guy says, what? And he says, those are my shorts. And I says, no, Stan Hansen gave me these shorts. And he said, well, I know, because those were mine. And he had mine. So we just, we interchanged clothes, and we drove down the road together, and we just it was a unique time, and we were both young and dumb, and didn't know fear, and used to run up into the stands and do things that you couldn't do today, and it was extremely dangerous back then, but I was real blind, and Frank didn't care, so it was just we go up there, and we did a lot of stuff for Bill Watts in that Oklahoma territory that, guys used to say, hey, you guys are really going to get hurt sometime. But, we were just too excited and thinking, we'll just go out and take it to the limit. And I think that's where we kind of grew close together.
Well, those were... I know when I got there in '77 and you were there, boy, those were full buildings, and everybody. I was just a punk kid, and I was making more money than I thought I could ever make, and I wasn't even a part of it. I was just there trying to learn, and but those were dangerous times during that time. But at that time, there was a lot of great security in a lot of those buildings as well that we were in.
There was. They had great security. I mean, there's. I mean, the people in the security in New Orleans and St. Bernard Parish.
That guy, what was that sheriff or whoever that was a big wrestling fan in Lafayette that really took care of us?
Yeah, well, I mean, Jimmy Killshaw, he was like the sheriff of Baton Rouge or deputy sheriff or something, and he was actually kind of in on the promotion that I always understood. But I got a quick story. One time they were calling Frank Gorilla Goodish, I mean, of course he'd get all mad at it, and everything, and get mad. So we were in St. Bernard one time, and we were in the ring, and it was before they started bringing these bananas and started, throwing bananas up into the thing because of Gorilla Goodish, right? So somebody threw this big banana up, and he went into the ring, and Frank, he was all mad at it and everything, and he went to stomp it. And at the same time, I saw it hit, and I went to, just like to kick it out of the ring. And when he stomped down, I kicked at the same time, and I caught his foot. And I and instead of sweeping the banana out, I caught his foot, and the guy took his foot up, and he took a big bump back. And I mean, the people went crazy. They just, I mean, we couldn't have timed it if we tried to do it. We couldn't do it again in a million years. It's just the timing was right. Frank went back on his back. Of course, he got up and hit the ropes and everything, and everybody was going crazy. But it was something that wasn't planned, and it was just the perfect timing. But anyway, there's a lot of stories like that, I guess.
I said earlier, Stan, you weren't on yet, but I said earlier that the first time I met Frank, they told me to wait at the TV station in Shreveport after taping the morning shows, and Frank Goodish was going to come back and pick me up. And I said, well, how will I know who it is? And they said, oh, you'll know. He's driving a white 240Z, I believe it was at that time.
That's right. Yeah.
Did you and him ride in that car together, the two of you?
We did, man. We were overlapped about, about a foot, our shoulders, I mean, that 240Z, in fact, he drove that car, so much, at that point in time, he had to go to the chiropractor. I mean, both our backs were bad from riding in that 240Z, and after I think he took it back to San Antonio or something, he never rode in a territory again, ever. After he quit driving in that 240Z, he rode with somebody. He went in there and didn't have a car. And
when he'd come to Dallas, when he'd come to Dallas, he'd ride with me, and because he'd just fly in on. That was after Love Field was open with not Brannan, but the Southwest, and he'd fly up to Dallas and go to Love Field, and we'd travel in and out of there, and but that's how I met him. And I know me and him, that first trip was to Jackson, Mississippi, and I sat over on the passenger side, and part of my back was on the door because there wasn't a lot of room in that front seat.
I know it. I tell you, that 240Z, man, and it was bottomed out too, man. There wasn't no the shocks were just all the way down. It was hard on our backs for sure. But,
it was sort of like I sort of thought there was going to be one of the mechanical arms come out and help him get out of there because of the way he sort of curled in and out to get in and out from behind that steering wheel,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, at that time, we were trying to look just as nasty and as foul as we could. We were just. I mean, he had this big curly, kind of big fro. It wasn't a fro, but it was just big curly head of hair, just naturally, right, and big old head of hair, and I had long, and I'd been influenced by Terry Funk and Dick Murdoch, so I'd been bleaching my hair, and I had this long hair, goatee, and everything, and one time Frank says, golly, after he says, man, I had this knot in my head, it's been bugging me for, about a week. And so finally somebody in the dressing room said, here, let me feel that. They went in there and they found this knot and they started pulling on it, and it was a big old wad of gum. Somebody had thrown it and it stuck in his hair for about a week, Oh, God, I never will forget that. He said, golly, I've been washing my hair at the shower and everything. I don't know. Anyway, that was funny. Big water gum in there. Yeah, we were pretty nasty, I must say.
I wonder, Barbara, do you know how many miles he put on that 240Z he had?
A lot.
A lot?
He always used to say that the car wore him. He didn't know. He wore the car. He had to put the car on him because it was so small and he was so big.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow. Do you? I don't want to I don't want to get off Frank right now, but your son, does he resemble his dad any? Does Jeff have some of his features or mannerisms or anything?
The eyes. There was a picture. Somebody did an article, Fighting Spirit magazine and UK magazine, did an article, and I was kind of like a guest columnist, and I sent over a couple of pictures. And a couple of pictures I sent over, one was of Jeff and one was of his dad. And it's the first time I've seen so much resemblance, because it was when Frank, of course, didn't have any beard or anything. It was before he got into wrestling. And just the way that both of them looked, you knew that it was father and son.
Wow. Intense eyes.
Yeah, because Jeff's eyes are so expressive. You know exactly what he's thinking without him even having to open his mouth. And that was like Frank as well. I mean, he could look at you and shut you down with his eyes the way he looked at you, and you knew, oops, he's mad, or he's glad. His eyes were so expressive.
Yeah, I'll remember. I always remember one night at the Sportatorium, and again, this was during the early 80s, and my brother was the booker, and Frank, I didn't realize that Frank was in the office talking with Ken, and the door wasn't shut, so I just sort of pushed my way in to say whatever I was going to say, and then realized Frank was in there. Oh, I'm sorry, and turned around. Just as I got in the door, there was, all I could see really was Kenny looking over at Frank, and Frank's head sort of coming up out of his lap and giving him one of those kind of looks that you two are talking about. And I don't know what the discussion was about, but I left and got out of the room, and Frank come and found me, and he said, boy, you timed that one right. And I said, hey, I don't want to know nothing about anything that was going on in there. And he said, well, it's just one of them problems when they say they want you to do this and you really need to do that. You just got to handle it. So I don't know what happened. I'm sure Stan probably knows more about those kind of discussions with bookers like that than I ever did. But I know it was one of those looks that I'm sure Frank gave a few times during his career. And you know what's so funny about that, and how it was different in Japan, because, and Stan, maybe you can elaborate. When you guys were there, you guys, not necessarily booked your own stuff and did your own stuff, but you were part of the decision making, I'm going to say, and lots of times here they wanted to leave the main guys out, and I think that was sometimes not fair to you guys. Is that true? I mean, is that sort of a true statement?
I think they might have asked our opinion on something sometime, but I think the final decision was always with John Baba, or mainly that was when Frank and I were together with Baba. The bottom line is I think we weren't afraid, and I think he encouraged us to say what we thought, if we had some ideas, or what direction or things to do and so forth and so on, business wise. He was very open to that. But I think there was a couple of times when we wanted to go one direction, but he thought it was right to go the other, and the bottom line, he was the boss, and we respected that, and I think he respected that we respected that, and I think that was one of the reasons we had a great working relationship. But we really didn't do anything except go out there, and they promoted us, and you just don't get a chance to really get promoted in a way, in the old school way of doing wrestling. They promoted us, and we took the football and we ran with it, to say, and and until they tried to business dictated that we get knocked back a step or something, but that didn't happen very often, and we went out and took it to them, and we made the Japanese, we got them up off their butts because they got tired of us running over them, and there was a real fight that went on. After a while, the Japanese got tired of the Texans, dominating the whole thing, and so that's where the real competition came, and even the Funks, we had some some great matches against the Funks, and they definitely weren't going to lay down for us because they were the established team there, and so when people say it's all a business and there wasn't any competition, that's just really not true, because there was always competition on what direction the match win, you know, and you know, so anyway, Frank and I were in a great position there, and I don't think we ever took advantage of it. But I think that disadvantage of the other people, but we were just out to do that, and that's what the Japanese paid us to do. They were happy we were doing it because we did great business.
Yeah, and those tag team tournaments, I think you and Frank were in, were just legendary over there. I mean, they, you know, like you said earlier, you know, he said the news got over to the United States the next day. The magazines, everybody picked up on the havoc that those tag team tournaments brought, and the competition, and the best there was. And
you know, we finally just wore people down, you know, and I think that was just from our football days and the hunger. We were both hungry, man. I mean, Bill Watts starved us out for a long time, but it wasn't Bill, but it was just you know, it was just the way it was. You know, we were green and not making any money, and we were hungry. And you know, in Japan there was an opportunity to make a little bit of money, and we just never changed our lifestyles, and that's why Frank was very successful at what he did, and you know, and so forth.
Were you in New York when he was when he wrestled as Goodish in New York?
No, it was actually when he came in. That's where he got the name Bruiser Brody. Vince Sr. gave him the name Bruiser Brody, and he brought Brody in. And he actually, I think he followed me in the Garden. You know, the way New York did back in '76. You know, and Frank came in right after me, I believe, and so we ended up being tagged up in New York a little bit too. You know, I worked with Bruno, and then, you know, I think Frank worked with Bruno later, and so that was kind of the way it all New York ran. But I'm almost positive that it was Vince Sr. that gave Brody his the Bruiser Brody name.
And that was before Japan really got started for both of you?
Yeah. This is, you know, actually Frank, after New York, after I left New York, and I went back and worked for Watts and then Georgia and some other places. Frank left New York after me, and that's when he went to Australia. I'm almost positive he went over to Australia for a year or so. And then he started going to Japan for all Japan, and by then I was kind of going for New Japan. And we were separated, but we were going for two different companies. He was being pushed in All Japan, kind of like I was being pushed in New Japan. So when this war started, you know, we ended up being on the same side, and it was really great business. People were anticipating, dreaming to seeing Brody and I together in Japan. Well, we were on two different companies, so when we did get hooked up, the Japanese fans were really excited.
And this is probably just a question for me, but like with Abby and let's say Tiger Jet Singh or
right.
Some of the other names that were over there when you guys were.
They were the top guys. They were the top guys when we were starting to get our push. You know, Jet Singh was the top guy at New Japan, and Butcher was the top guy at All Japan. And then war started. You know, then they both jumped sides, and you know, and I ended up jumping too. You know, and everything. So it was just it was something. You know, it was a great opportunity for us, but. The Butcher and Tiger Jet Singh were the really the top guys when Frank and I started really getting an opportunity to go often.
You guys had great relationships as far as I knew. I never saw any kind of problems or anything with those other two guys. I mean, they were sort of they were the old guard, and you two were coming in as a fresh guard. I mean, you guys all got along, didn't you? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you know what? I have great respect for Jet Singh. You know, I mean, he's the one that really influenced me. The first time I saw him, you know, the first time I went for New Japan, I saw him, and I mean, I'd gone to All Japan when I was like green guy, for the Fonts booked me there, and I saw Abdullah, and I have great respect for Abdullah too. But when I saw Jet Saint, I mean, he was the guy that lit the fire in me. I saw him, how he conducted his business, and I said, I'm a cowboy, and that's the way I'm going, And I tried to develop my own style, and I did. But he was the guy that really influenced me, to try to establish myself, And but he was a great talent, and well respected, and people still, revere him, well.
Yeah, he. My first trip to Japan at 18, Leo Garibaldi booked me on a trip, and my first trip, of course, I was prefaced by Frank to be in shape and go over there and kick their butts and blow them up, and they'll tell you, let's go home, and that was my introduction into how to go over there and be ready to fight them. And then I get there, my first night, I'm in the main event as Tiger Jet Singh's tag team partner, and that's quite an experience for an 18-year-old to get that experience, and like you said, to watch Tiger and how he ran through the crowd and bent the sword and did all this stuff was pretty amazing to see that, and then to see you and Frank sort of push it to that next level over the next 7 or 8 years was pretty outstanding.
Yeah. There were some great guys before us. I think King Curtis. Frank always talked highly of King Curtis and how he was kind of the guy that really kind of took Frank underneath the wing and kind of taught him some of the the ways he kind of emulated King Curtis and how he did his business. And then. I mean, there was just a lot of great talent, in Japan too, both on the Gaijin side, but also on the Japanese side. I mean, they have some great talent, and, you're only as good as your talent. And, the guys, I mean, you're only as good as your competition is what I'm trying to say. And they had great competition, they had young guys and they had established guys. And, after a while, they got tired. I mean, they could see that we were, running head and shoulders, and they had to fight. And that's where the great competition come in, the Japanese young guys, and then there was the younger group of guys that I was involved with, Mazawa, Kawada, Kobashi. I mean, they were all just great talent. And it's just, I mean, it was really good. And so Frank was involved with, the Funks and Tenaru and Jumbo and golly, and then on the Noki side, there's, actually there was Maida before he became, a big star. He was the young guy, and Fujinami was a great wrestler, and of course Inoki himself and Baba. I mean, it was just great talent to work against, and we were really fortunate to be there, and I think we just carved out a niche there where the Japanese fans really got with us and our style.
I was going to ask Stan, was Dory Sr. around when you started? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, he was actually. I started January 1st, 73, but in senior passed away, I think,
May of 73, something like that.
Yeah, so he was there when I first broke in, and he was, Terry. I knew Terry more than I knew Dory. Junior had the strap, and he was traveling around, but Senior and Dory and Terry, were the ones that got me in and everything. And then, sad to say, I was down in Florida for about 3 months when Senior passed away. But the first time I think I got the Inoki had a show up in Calgary. And
I remember meeting you up here. I think Fujinami worked with Dynamite, if I recall correctly. And I think
right.
You were with maybe Sakaguchi or Inoki, and they brought up. I think Tiger Jeet may have been on that card too, if I recall. Maybe 79, something like that.
Yeah, I can't remember if Jet Sane was there, but I remember, there's two people in the wrestling business that's probably been imitated more than anybody. Jim Barnett and your dad. And then, I'd heard about he had the suit on, and he had this strap all over the lapel and everything, and danged if we didn't, we got up there on television, and the first time I ever met him, he said, we got this big guy from Texas, and come over here, and I go in there, and it's just like I'd heard 1,000 people imitate him.
Yeah.
And then I looked on his coat, and there was some tight crap on his, on his lapel, and I fell out. I think I started laughing. I couldn't believe it. I said, God, this is the real deal here.
Yeah, it is fascinating that Barnett and Stu were kind of like, everyone had
everybody, oh my boy, or something. They had everybody would have an imitation of those two guys. So
I remember Stu had some rookie on the phone, and he was giving him shit for something, and this rookie said, "That's not you, Stu. That's somebody impersonating you." And Stu got her. This is the old bastard himself.
Stan, I got Ross Hart on. Ross, go ahead. I know you had a question for Stan.
Yeah. I know how successful you'd been as a tag team for All Japan when Bruiser returned to work for All Japan, and you guys were there, I think, in '88. Was the plan to use you guys in a singles program against each other? Because that would have done phenomenal business together. Yeah.
Yeah, there was an opportunity there, I guess, that we never, it really was never ever superly, I don't know of anybody really discussing it, but I think everybody from the Japanese side to Frank and I both knew that was something that could and would be some great business, into the future. But, of course.
Oh, it would have packed the Sumo Hall or the Budokan, but you had such success as a tag team, and we're pretty much unbeatable there. So, naturally, it would have been a dream match if you'd worked with each other, or even done a program, and you probably still could have tag teamed after that. But over in Japan, a lot of the Americans or the Gaijin would work against each other and then tag team, like you did that with Stan Hansen, or with Terry Gordy and Steve Williams, and a lot of other boys.
Right.
And so it would have been a natural rivalry, but unfortunately it didn't happen. But just incredible. Did you ever work against Bruiser, even in Oklahoma or Louisiana?
No, the only time we ever worked was actually in a tag tournament.
Okay.
They're in Japan, and he was teamed with Jimmy Snuka, and
that's right. Yeah.
And I was with Terry Gordy, and and we just kind of connected a couple of times, in the whole match, and you could feel the electricity. To be honest, I can still remember.
The crowd must have just gone nuts if they saw you against each other, even in a tag match. That would have been just phenomenal, Stan.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it's too bad that didn't happen, but in a way, I'm kind of glad it didn't, because I think we, as a team and everything, we kind of stand out as the kind of a unique kind of team that there wasn't, business didn't come into it. We were, when we were together, we were really, really a close team, and of course. I think business-wise, it would have been phenomenal business, but I guess looking back, I'm glad that everybody's memory is us together,
Yeah.
Yeah, you were monster stars, and nobody equaled you for sure. Just incredible the legacy you had there, and you did so much for the whole industry there, and you really saved All Japan, at a time when it was pretty vulnerable and had lost a lot of its top stars to New Japan, and you and Frank really were responsible for keeping the company alive, and your matches with Baba and Tsuruta and the Funks were just incredible, and they'll always have their place in history in Japan.
I appreciate that. I to agree or not agree, sound like it make myself sound too. But I think we one of the reasons that I actually had talked to Frank, and I said, what, if all Japan does happen to go out of business, it's going to be the crap for everybody, because then there's no competition at all, and so they I don't know how bad a shape they were, but anyway, if they were in bad shape, they ended up doing great business for about 10 years. So
yeah, they sure did. Thanks to you guys, in large part.
Well, there was a lot of guys. There's a lot of guys involved in that. It wasn't just Frank and I, but we were involved in it, and I'm happy to say I was part of it.
Bruce, another 2 hours, and just talking about Frank, I know you said you never had the privilege of meeting him, but I think now you have a gist of that power that he had. I mean, he really had a power about him.
Yeah, there's so many, it seemed like there's a lot of common ground there with all those names that were being mentioned, that I fortunately did have a chance to meet, including, some of those Texas guys, so, but yeah, I certainly was delighted to hear all the stories, and I sort of feel like I know him now, even though I never met him, and I can see why he's so well respected and revered, even to this day. He sort of has an iconic status. So
yeah, and I do want to take just a moment and apologize to a couple people that held for a while. I'm sorry I didn't get to them, but listening to those stories, and I hope we asked the right kind of questions that everybody really enjoyed hearing and knowing the answer to, because again, like I said earlier in the show with Bruce, in my mind, the two gentlemen that we talked about tonight, and the gentleman that came on, Stan Hansen, the two of them were the real independent guys that took this business, respected it, and took it to a different level, and made their mark. I mean, if you want to put a watermark on professional wrestling, or a barcode, or whatever you want to put on it, and you don't include Stan Hansen and Bruiser Brody, it would like using the word dungeon and not talking about your father. I mean, they go together, and again, I am very honored and proud to get to know Frank and Stan, and called them both my friend throughout the years, and it's just an honor being around guys like that, and I really believe that the elder statesmen that brought them in and taught them the right way to do it is what had them teach the young guys they mentored the right way and the way to do it. Much like your family has passed on the craft, it's something that's being a lost art, and it's a dirty shame, because the great people are out there in this business. We just don't know enough of them yet.
I can't thank you and all the other guests we had on tonight enough for, it's a really fascinating conversation, and I hope some of the listeners out there enjoyed it as much as I did.